Thanks.
Good to see you. Cheers.
Good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for this session on open contracting. My name is Sanjay Pradhan. I'm the Vice President for Change, Knowledge and Learning at the World Bank Group. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this session where I must say I have an extremely distinguished panel here with me. You know them well, so I will be brief in their introduction. We have Jamie Drummond, who's the Executive Director and co-founder of One. Next to him, Jane Dudman. She's the Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian's Public Leaders Network and is Head of Content across The Guardian's public services and not-profit professional networks. Then we have Julian Olivas, who is the Acting Secretary of Administrative Responsibilities and Public Procurement. Beth Novak is the founder and director of Gov Labs at NYU, earlier with the White House. And we have Francis Maud, who's the UK Minister for the Cabinet Office and Paymaster General. So very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us, and to all of you. I thought I'd just begin by offering just very brief background and context from the perspective of the World Bank, just to lay out the background and context for this. So for the World Bank Group, the starting point is that the governors of the World Bank Group, which represent 188 member countries, endorsed two principles, one of which is to end extreme poverty by 2030, which Prime Minister Cameron referred to also this morning in his opening plenary, and to boost shared prosperity. Now, what these goals mean for us as a collective is that we need to have a deeper and faster impact in the lives of 1.2 billion people who live on less than $1.25 a day. And we also need to have an impact, a deeper and faster impact, in the lives of an additional 2.7 billion people who live on between $1.25 a day and $4 a day. That's a massive challenge to reach and lift 4 billion people out of poverty or vulnerability. And so the challenge for us is, in a fiscally and financially constrained environment that we find ourselves in, where will the acceleration of this impact in the lives of all these people come from if we are fiscally and financially constrained? And that's where openness in budgets, openness in contracts, openness in development, openness in aid, openness can be the accelerator. And if we can have much greater impact from the vast amounts of resources that are spent by governments, whether financed by aid or not, or by domestic taxpayers, then we can have a much more accelerated impact. And instead of this, so globally, $9.5 trillion are spent by governments through contracts. But many of these contracts are shrouded in secrecy, which then become fertile grounds for corruption, collusion, or patronage. And this, combined with poor oversight of the implementation of contract, means that the poor may not have in their schools may not be built, supplies may not reach hospitals, bridges may not be repaired, and that's the tangible impact. So what we seek to do through open contracting is to have disclosure and participation, disclosure of the terms of the contract, and participation and oversight by non-governmental actors. And what's heartening to see is that this must therefore become a norm. This must become a standard of disclosure and participation. And what's heartening to see is that this is gradually gaining momentum. Just last year in Johannesburg, we had the first meeting on open contracting. And in the most recent G8 meeting, it was underscored the importance of transparency in contracting, was underscored. The new EITI standards recommend transparency in contracting. The open contracting principles have been developed by multiple stakeholders, and the open contracting partnership was formalized by representatives from government, civil society, and multilateral organizations. So this is what's been happening at the global level. And right here, it's very heartening to see at this summit that a number of countries are endorsing or incorporating open contracting principles in their national plans. On the ground, we are also seeing, we ourselves are working in about 25 countries, many of them in Africa, on open contracting. And just to give you one example, in Ghana, for instance, the government has disclosed the terms of the contract in the oil sector and has disclosed the use of oil revenues, which is being used for 7 road construction projects. Civil society organizations advocated for this kind of a disclosure. They monitored the use of the oil revenues, and they have issued a value for money assessment of roads. There are many such examples. So these are the kinds of things we want to see more of. And with this, with this introduction, I just turn to our panel, who can help us explore the power of open contracting, what more can be done, and how it can mix with other initiatives that are underway. So with this, I want to first begin with Minister Maud, if I may, to ask that the UK has recently announced robust commitments to open contracting in the revised OGP national plans, and you've invested, Minister, in open contracting, in contract and transparency. So I wanted to explore from you, what does the UK see as the value of open contracting from your perspective?
Well, like every government, we face 2 twin challenges. We don't have a lot of money. We have a massive budget deficit. And the citizens' expectations of government services are rising. People expect the quality of public services to improve. And so we, like all governments, we need to make every pound we spend buy more. And that means when we procure, when we commission services or systems or programs from outside, from business, we absolutely need to get the best possible value. And the way contracting was being done, procurement was being done in Britain, frankly excluded some of the most competitive bidders there were. And the smaller ones, it was too expensive, too slow, and too closed, and too much potential for there to be a closed group, an oligopoly of suppliers. So opening up contracting, saying every contract, we've said over £10,000, the opportunity should be advertised openly on our Contracts Finder website. Then the whole process made transparent as you go through it. And this is culturally very difficult, both for bidders and for the contracting authority, for the state. The default setting of governments has historically been to be closed. Different parts of the state will come up with numerous very creative reasons why transparency can't possibly be right. I've seen some contracts prepared for publication where everything virtually has been redacted on the grounds that it's commercially confidential. And actually, you look at what's involved. Of course, there are going to be some things in contracts that you can't reveal. I mean, there are some genuine national security things you're absolutely going to want to protect. But it illustrates in a very concrete way the need for governments to move from a default setting, which is to be closed and secretive, to a default setting where the presumption is you're open, you publish. As a result, we get a much better chance of seeing that the money goes to what's needed, is spent on what's needed in the most effective way. And every government, whatever your stage of economic development, we all have that same intense pressure to ensure that the money goes to buy the service or the piece of infrastructure or whatever it is on behalf of the citizen in the best possible way. And there's no substitute for openness.
Thank you very much, Minister. That's very inspirational for others to hear, and especially to hear that the same kinds of challenges and excuses are being espoused in other parts of the world also. Let me turn to Minister Olivas. Mexico has become a leader in both disclosure and civic participation in public contracting. And we understand you're also announcing today that Mexico is endorsing the open contracting global principles. We wanted to explore what has led you to endorse the principles, and what is the Mexican government doing or will continue to do to further strengthen open contracting practices going forward? I just want to say that Mr. Olivas is going to be speaking in Spanish, so you may want to put on your headphones for those who don't understand Spanish. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sí, muy buenos días, muchas gracias. Para México ha sido muy importante el tema de las contrataciones públicas, ya que a través del portal que hemos denominado Compranet en nuestro país, se han aperturado totalmente todas las contrataciones para adquisición de bienes, para adquisición de servicios y para los contratos de obra pública. En la actualidad, en México, las personas que desean vender al gobierno alguno de estos bienes, de estos servicios o realizar estas obras, tienen el acceso totalmente libre para participar a través del portal. Anteriormente, México tenía un programa cerrado de contrataciones, solamente las personas que estaban registrados previamente en un padrón y que compraban las bases de contratación podían participar. Hoy en día el acceso a través de la página web es muy rápido, muy accesible y permite que toda la sociedad pueda conocer las necesidades del gobierno, porque independientemente de la contratación que se hace de cada bien, de cada servicio, se plantea desde el inicio del ejercicio presupuestario todos los programas de adquisiciones, todos los programas de obra pública que tienen los ministerios de México y las entidades. Entonces, esto permite tener una transparencia total. ¿Qué representa para México esta apertura hacia la sociedad? Pues representa casi $1 billón, es decir, aproximadamente el 40% del presupuesto total de las dependencias y entidades, equivalentes al 25% del presupuesto de egresos de la Federación. Y esto viene a ser casi el 8% del Producto Interno Bruto de nuestro país. Tenemos aún áreas de oportunidad en este tema. ¿Y qué es lo que nosotros estamos buscando en los próximos años? Aumentar la participación de licitantes electrónicos, aumentar la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas en estos temas, y algo que estamos agregando en el programa de acción para los próximos años de gobierno abierto en México es lograr que algunos datos que interesan a la sociedad se incorporen en nuestro portal de web. Y doy un ejemplo, algo que inquieta mucho a los participantes vendedores del gobierno es, por ejemplo, el tiempo en que se paga el bien o el servicio que se adquiere. Vamos a transparentar cuál es el tiempo que se lleva este pago de bien, este pago de servicio. Y adicionalmente, para encontrar mayores áreas de oportunidad, vamos a tener la opción de hacer encuestas con las personas que participen para que podamos nosotros encontrar las deficiencias que hay todavía en algunas de nuestras dependencias y entidades, y además poder tener un ranking de nuestras dependencias y entidades. Eso lo vamos a implementar a partir del próximo programa de acción, que será cuando iniciemos el ejercicio del presupuesto 2014.
Thank you, Minister. That was, I really want to acknowledge and congratulate the leadership of Mexico in this area. It's actually going to set an important trend for others to follow. With this, I want to turn to Beth Novak. Beth, based on your experience, both in open government earlier, now with Gov Labs, what do you think is needed for open contracting to contribute to the open government movement and to actually make a difference in the lives of ordinary citizens?
Thank you. So thank you also to folks for indulging I need my own translator from cold to English, but I hope you can understand me because I am very delighted to be here and honored, and just the mention of the word open government movement as opposed to open government just makes me smile. I will get well sooner. So as we've already heard, the tremendous amount of money, 40% of the Mexican budget, you've mentioned trillions of dollars around the world that's spent on contracts. The impact of this cannot be underestimated in terms of the way that we deliver goods and services to citizens, as you've discussed, in the best possible ways using taxpayer dollars. I think the notion of moving towards open is incredibly powerful, and we see this even before we introduce technology into the equation, when a group like MKSS takes accessible data from the budgets in India and starts to paint it on the walls in Rajasthan and helps people to identify bridges built to nowhere, that school that wasn't constructed. We can already do better by people. But when we make the data really open, then when we make it computable, we know the extent to which we can accelerate, as we've seen in every other sector, our ability to really spot the trends. Obviously, of fraud, waste, and abuse, the ability to decrease corruption is paramount, and we can do that when we start to make the contracts open such that we can analyze them in new ways. But there's also new opportunities, I would argue, when we can have open contracts as open data that are computable, and we see there are 50 different contracts for different types of paving stones for a road, we might say, gee, maybe we should pick one type of paving stone. When there are 50 contracts with the same entity, or we begin to have red flags that go up. And more importantly, when we can mash up contract data with other types of data, such as data about open corporate data, and we know that what look like 50 different entities are actually the same company, all getting the same contracts. When we can do that kind of mashing up, then we realize that we might be able to improve the situation. Are we giving contracts to companies that have environmental violations, to workplace safety violations? We aren't governing, we aren't spending that 40%, 50% of the budget nearly as well as we could. In every other business and industry, CEOs are using analytics to understand how better to run what they do. And I think open contracting is such an important step on the way to helping government not just be more accountable, but to be more effective in the way that it works. That's not an issue simply of transparency. It's about building the ecosystem of collaborators, not just those inside government, but outside government, who are going to do those analytics, who are going to build those tools to help us have that understanding. So I think really important for this movement is that whereas we're focused on government and civil society as important cornerstones in that movement, we have to also bring business to the table, because it's banks, insurance companies, other data-driven and information-intensive businesses that are going to have the ability and the tools to help us make sense of the contracts as we free them and make them available, such that we can turn what starts as transparency, what starts as accountability, into more effective governance and the better delivery of services for citizens.
Great, thank you very much, Beth. Jamie, I want to turn to you. So open contracting data is becoming increasingly accessible, and this will be facilitated further if we develop a standard for open contracting data. But I wanted to explore with you, what do you see as the potential to leverage open contracting data with other sources of information, such as budget information? How can this help us follow the money, which will help us improve budget development outcomes for the poor?
Thanks, Sanjay. If you can indulge me just a second before I get to that, I just want to repeat our congratulations to the government, the Prime Minister and Minister Maud, for the move on beneficial ownership this morning.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned an open government movement. That's why we need an open government movement. It's not yet law in this country. It has to go on and include trusts. It has to go to Europe. It has to go to the world. That's why we need a movement. But a great move happened this morning. And by the way, that's going to be a lot of data. That data has to link up to, amongst other things, open contracts.
Yeah.
And it's the interoperability of the standards between, who owns these companies, are those companies bidding for these open contracts? Right. Now we can start to see. Right. So that's why we're all here, and that's why all these things are linked. You mentioned the size of the prize, the 9.5 trillion, some percentage that is very large of that is in contracts. We, however, as we look at that, that's the reason to do all of this. That's right. But I think the real reason everyone's in this room is because we've all stood by that roadside. We've all stood by that crumbling piece of local municipal infrastructure that wasn't up to scratch because the concrete was watered down, because the right piece of equipment wasn't delivered on time, because the contract wasn't open. Right. And it is that sort of lack of openness in the contract which erodes the social contract, which results in that local user of that local piece of municipal infrastructure, that road, that school, that hospital, the look in their eyes of mixture of anger and depression when that service was not properly provided as it should have been. And it is the reinvestment in the social contract that is why we need these open contracts. You mentioned the Ghanaian example. I was sitting down with those exact groups in Accra a few weeks ago, and they were looking through how the oil money from the extraction contracts was going through the open government budget into local projects in the road sector. Okay. And that is what this game is all about, which is, so citizens like the African Center for Energy Policy, Mohammed there, and Emmanuel Kuyol from Revenue Watch in Ghana can go through the contracts, see their local, how the money is supposed to be spent on the roads, and by the way, give the government hell, because as it happens, the numbers didn't quite add up. And it's when citizens like that can follow the money that governments are encouraged to do their job better. And that's why we need things like the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative and so on, so that it links all of these things up. The interoperability of these standards is something that's particularly important. I think we have David Hall Matthews here from Publish What You Fund. They're doing great work on aid transparency standards. If those could be adapted and adopted more widely by the other sectors that we're all addressing here, that could go some way because to making sure that all of these different data sets can talk to each other and citizens can see the money through. Just one little note I've got to say, part of the problem I think with this entire sector, as it is with development as a whole, is we've got a big problem with language. If you go to all of these sessions in parallel room 5 we're in, there's other parallel rooms having parallel discussions. You take the words transparency, accountability, open, and initiative, you move them around a bit, you add in construction sometimes, aid sometimes, we're having very similar conversations. So it's obvious that these data sets should all talk to each other. And I just want to call out whichever World Bank geek came up with the Road Open Contract Knowledge System acronym, ROCS, because it's one of the better acronyms for this sector. And it may sound like a joke. Myself and Bob Geldof a few years ago, at our frustration with this sector's proliferation of acronyms, came up for the Campaign for Responsible Acronym Production. Because, the way we talk about these things is a problem. And we do need these conversations to be linked up, which is why it's so great that we're all here in these, albeit parallel sessions, talking to each other, because we need more of that. And it's not just our data sets that need to talk to each other. It's also the people who work with these data sets. And maybe there's a sociability issue with some of the characters involved. But it's precisely this ability for open contracts to sit at the center of a hub. It's the hub at the center of a wheel, which links all these other sectors together, that allows vantage into all of these other sectors. And that's what's so important and central about open contracts, and why we're pleased and delighted to be part of this panel and the campaign to bust them open, because it's their silo busting potential that particularly matters. We were at a session, some of us earlier this week, about zombie data. So we're busting phantom firms this morning. We've also got to deal with zombie data. It is also Halloween, if you hadn't noticed. We need to be linking up these various locations of opacity and introducing openness and capacity to deal with that.
Very good, Jamie. Thank you very much. That was I love this notion of the sort of lack of openness in these contracts undermining the social contract. It's a very powerful notion, but also the plea to connect these various parallel open initiatives. With that, let me turn to Jane. Jane, great to hear from you on the role of media in all of this. What do you think is the role of media in setting standards for open contracts and holding public leaders to account?
Well, I mean, I think it's really great to hear Jamie say that people need to speak to each other, because wherever people need to speak to each other, you need a media. I mean, what we're all about, to state the absolute blindingly obvious, is about communication. And it was very interesting at the open contracting breakfast that we had yesterday. One of the kind of things that came through there was about practical ways for people to understand best practice examples and what's going on in different parts of the world. And I think the media has an absolutely crucial role at that level to put people in touch with one another. And not just to put people in touch with one another, but to actually tell stories. I mean, Beth makes the point, this isn't a movement for its own sake. It's actually about something. It's actually about delivering effective services. And the more that you can tell the stories of what is actually happening around the world and how people are actually making this work for themselves and their countries and their communities, I think that's an absolutely vital role for the media. But of course, there's also the other really important role, which is about holding public leaders to account. And you would expect me to say this, but of course I come from The Guardian. I think we do quite a good job in terms of holding people to account. And thank you. I'll pass that on to my colleagues. Prime Minister David Cameron this morning extolled societies where close tabs are kept on the powerful. The point of the media is to speak truth to power. There is, we need to really reinforce that role. And, I will congratulate myself, the UK government. We have seen the most amazing release of data since this government came into power, and that's not something that comes naturally to a Guardian journalist to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. We have seen the most amazing release of data and this drive for openness, and we've seen the results of that very, very clearly in the impact it has had on kind of efficiency and on the award of contracts. And I think we've seen that very specifically with some of the recent events. We've had resignations at some of the suppliers who have been deemed not to be, anyway, some other suppliers. And also at yesterday's breakfast, Sir Mark Moody-Stewart, who the former chair, of course, of Anglo-American, said a very great thing. He said, you must treat commercial confidentiality with great suspicion. And that's something I think that we should all take as a kind of talisman and a motto, and something that we really try and do, and I think that's very important for us to do in the media. It's very easy to use commercial confidentiality as a kind of veil and a cloak, and we know how many of these services are now being supplied by private companies. It's very important to ensure that we have as open a reach into those companies that are delivering these very important public services as our own public sector, who are, of course, open to a huge amount of scrutiny all of the time. So it's very important to us, I think, to have a responsible media. This is a huge part of our role, and I'm very pleased to see that Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, agrees with us on this and says there's a very clear role for the beady-eyed media, so we should continue to do that. It is perhaps an irony that yesterday the UK signed a royal charter that on press regulation that many fear may well constrain the UK press. We certainly hope that won't be so. At The Guardian, we will continue to lead, we hope, by example, on strengthening, on holding both public and indeed private leaders to account on everything they do in public services. I will just say one thing, because it's often felt that, it's often thought of the media as a national entity. Of course, all of you here and all of those who are, following the proceedings today will know that actually what happens locally and your relationships with the local media are far and away the most important thing. Actually getting your message out via local media is both challenging and hugely important. In some parts of the world there may only be only one news outlet, there may only be one radio station, there may only be one way of getting that message out, and I understand that is a very difficult thing to do sometimes. But I think building those clear messages and telling stories is a very important thing to do. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jane. So, look, the purpose of this session is to hear from our esteemed panel, but also to engage, have a two-way conversation. So I just want to open this up to see if you have, to invite you to share your questions for the panel. We also have feeds coming from Twitter, and people can submit their questions on #OpenContracting. So we invite you to do that, and we will be asking some questions online from online as well. So why don't I just open it up, see who has a question or comment? Go ahead. And please make your interventions brief and identify yourself. That'll be great. There's a mic.
Bill Anderson from Development Initiatives and Technical Lead on the International Aid Transparency Initiative. Aid is just one part that is waiting for open contracting, but if I can just point to two issues that we are gagging for already. Firstly, if you look at, there's a study that's been done by Development Gateway and the Open Aid Partnership in Nepal that is taking aid projects from the Aid Information Management System and looking at the procurement and contracting detail below that and plotting that, very detailed subnational geocoding. It's a great pilot study of what is there. The other thing that is waiting, ready to happen, is that if you look at the UK Department of International Development's new Dev Tracker site, which is being launched tomorrow, and if you look at a particular project called the Global Poverty Action Fund, and on there's a tab which says Partners, and it lists a number of projects funded by DFID that are carried out by NGOs. And if you click on one of those, you will see the full detail of that project. That is not data that is sitting in the DFID system. That is data that has been picked up by the Dev Tracker from the way the NGO has published their own data and sucked in. What is waiting on that Dev Tracker is for another tab saying contracts, and that we can have complete compatibility between the aid data and the contracting data so that the contracts can be embedded within the aid data. We're ready and waiting. As soon as the open contracting standard is ready, we're ready to go and work with you on that.
It's very good. Very good. Thank you. We'll collect a few interventions. Yes, there's one on the left there. On the left there. Go ahead.
I'm Peter Matthews from the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative. We're very pleased to have been intimately involved in open contracting through the working group. My question is to Minister Maud, but I think it might apply more broadly. It's not just in the UK. We're very pleased that the UK is one of the countries that's involved in the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative. One of the challenges we face, and there are obviously challenges in all countries, is that a lot of the big procuring entities in the UK, a lot of those vehicles through which the government invests in infrastructure are set up as arm's length vehicles. So although in the UK, for example, Infrastructure UK and the Treasury is very supportive of cost, they are somewhat limited in the extent at which they can persuade those arm's length vehicles, such as Network Rail, to be more open in terms of disclosing information. I understand why this set up at arm's length, to try and prevent political interference in the operation of those vital infrastructure assets. But it is increasingly going to be a challenge, it seems to me, is how we bring those arm's length vehicles into the open contracting arena. And I'd be happy to hear what the Minister has to say about that. Thank you.
Okay. There was a question on the left side at the back. The gentleman who has a headphone. I'm seeing if there's anyone here.
Buenos días, gracias por la oportunidad de exponer una impresión. Ya voy a esperar que todos tengan sus audífonos. ¿Ya? Okay. Mi nombre es Carlos Gasnel. Yo trabajo en Transparencia Internacional, capítulo de Panamá. la oportunidad de tener un portal electrónico como el que tenemos, Panamá Compras, es fantástica, ¿no? Le ha dado la oportunidad al periodismo investigativo de encontrar muchas veces insumos para realizar reportajes y ahí muchas veces se ve la corrupción. En Panamá hemos avanzado mucho en esto, sin embargo creo que hemos retrocedido y me gustaría saber si en el grupo de trabajo se van a incorporar temas como por ejemplo la reducción de los plazos para presentar propuestas. Muchas veces lo que se gana en transparencia con los portales electrónicos se pierde con regulación y hemos experimentado reducción en los plazos, a veces plazos de 4 horas para presentar una propuesta, un día. Entonces eso le da la oportunidad a quien tiene información privilegiada de presentar propuestas con más tiempo de antelación. Igual la limitación de presentar reclamos a través de fianzas. En mi país, el que pierda una licitación tiene que presentar una fianza del 15% del valor del contrato para poder presentar un reclamo. Entonces eso al final se gana mucho en transparencia, pero se pierde con otro tipo de limitaciones. Me gustaría saber si esos temas van a ser abordados como complemento en los grupos de trabajo. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Let me take a couple of questions from online. Felipe, if you could relay a couple of questions, then I'll come back to the panel and then we'll take another round.
Good morning.
I think it's
Good
on.
morning, everybody.
It's on.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you to the panel. We have a great conversation online, as you can see in the screens. If you have questions, we encourage you to please send them to us with #OpenContracting. There's 2 great questions that have already emerged, and I wanted to bring them to the panel. They, I think, apply to all of you. David Hall-Matthews, who's sitting right here, has tweeted asking, can transparent contract disclosure bring different transparency campaigns together? And we also have a question from Jennifer Moore, who asks, isn't it important that when public authorities go out to tender, they make public who is tendering before the contract is awarded?
Okay. So why don't we go this way? Minister Maud, do you want to begin first?
Yes, happy to. I think those questions about the extent of openness in terms of disclosing who the bidders are. This needs to be done in a way that enables there to be kind of blind bidding, so you don't sort of get to see what everyone else's bid is before you make your own. That's kind of fair. But I think there are different ways of doing this, and I think what will emerge is a best practice approach. The issue about arm's length bodies who are taking forward construction projects. Yeah, I mean, I think that if it's the state contracting in whatever form it takes, we would expect the same principles to approach. And we've certainly taken the view in relation to the whole of central government, everything that's within the central government ambit, the same principles should apply. Were there other questions I ought to pick up? Should we move on to Beth?
Okay, Beth, go ahead.
So I think particularly, so a number of wonderful initiatives were pointed to, and this last intervention that was made, I think highlighted a very important point, that there are many different stages in the procurement, tendering, contracting process. And I think it's important to disaggregate the different steps in order to identify the opportunities for transparency and, more importantly, for engagement at every stage in the process. So even before we talk about releasing who's been awarded the contract, when we're talking about what the problem is for which we are bidding a solution, we have the opportunity to engage people through brainstorming, through new kinds of online techniques, to engage people in their own communities in identifying the problems on the ground so that we can correctly identify what the problem is. Then far too often in contracting, we already talk about the solution. We talk about getting the best price on the mousetrap to solve the problem of the mice, when in fact there might be more creative and better ideas, like a good kind of cheese that is the right way to catch the mice, not the mousetrap. And we're missing the opportunity to engage with innovators, with entrepreneurs, with scientists, with students in our own communities who may be able to enter the contracting process and deliver solutions, who are outside the usual suspects of those companies who are now getting all of the contracts. When we talk about drafting the RFPs, we're not collaboratively working together to write them in ways that might be simpler and easier. When we put out the tenders, there are some communities that are starting to use video and YouTube or Vimeo as a way to communicate more clearly what the bid is so that more people can participate, again, so we can break open the silo and the stranglehold that the usual suspects have on these processes. So it's not enough to simply analyze after the fact. Thank God we have these beneficial ownership rules that will help us to uncover where that corruption lies. But far upstream, I think it's so important that we start thinking about how all of us can participate in identifying the problems and identifying solutions in bidding and becoming part of the process of doing business with government as another way and approach to hopefully ending the stranglehold of corruption.
Thank you, Beth. Minister Olivas.
Sí, me quisiera referir a comentario de Carlos Gasnel de Panamá. Sin duda alguna, el establecer fianzas para poder presentar inconformidades, como les llamamos en México, pues inhibe totalmente la presentación de este tipo de inconformidades que llegan a tener los proveedores y los contratistas. En México no se les pide ninguna garantía para que puedan acceder a una inconformidad y la inconformidad es resuelta por la Secretaría de la Función Pública en base a las pruebas que ofrece el inconforme y se le da vista al que resultó ganador para que también pueda aportar las pruebas correspondientes y de esta manera se emite una resolución imparcial. Creo que también vale la pena destacar en el sistema de Compranet mexicano que cuando hay algunas dudas o donde se pueden hacer aportaciones por parte de los proveedores y los contratistas es en una etapa del proceso de contratación pública que se llama aclaración de bases. Ahí los proveedores y los contratistas preguntan a la institución que está licitando la compra del bien o la contratación de la obra pública algunas dudas sobre el proyecto, sobre todo en el caso de obra pública, algunas aclaraciones para que se pueda determinar por la entidad licitante cuál es el sentido, cuál es la idea, cuál es el requerimiento que tiene en ese momento la dependencia y entidad. Y esto al final lo que viene es a clarificar y a perfeccionar las bases de contratación. Es un instrumento que se utiliza cotidianamente en estos proyectos que realiza el gobierno mexicano y que en muchas ocasiones pues no tiene la especificidad que quisiera el que va a vender el servicio, el que va a realizar la obra. Y esto nos ayuda y es un proceso abierto donde todos escuchan esta aclaración, todos los que están participando en la licitación escuchan esta aclaración y llegan a un punto determinado que logra en ocasiones hasta modificar las bases de contratación que se publicaron en Compranet.
Thank you. Jane, any thoughts from you?
A couple of thoughts. It's good to hear about that participation in Mexico before contracts are let, and Beth's absolutely right. It's all about getting that participation. Just a thought on that. I was actually in my local library last night for my book group. We were discussing, by the way, George Orwell's 1984, which I recommend you all reread. It's highly prescient and chilling. However, there's as you know, there are kind of discussions about the futures of libraries in this country, and there's a consultation going on at the moment in our own library, and our book group looked at one another, and one of the members said, yes, we'll all fill that in, but of course they've already decided. And I think, one of the things that we really have to combat is that kind of cynicism about participation. You all are all about kind of taking part and really making sure that citizens can fill that role and actually not be cynical that things have pre-decided. The other thing I just wanted to say was that Francis Mood is absolutely right about the principles being applied in central government. I think what worries some of us, and it's a good point about the arm's length bodies, is what happens in different parts of our public sector. In local government, in the NHS, there is in schools, in education, there is sometimes increasingly a fragmentation of services as they are put out to different contractors that can make it more difficult to actually find out what is going on. And I think that is a very real issue that we do have to consider.
Francis, did you want to come in on this point?
No, I think Jane is right. I mean, we have a very widespread and dispersed wider public sector. And the approach the coalition government takes is to be rather localist in our approach, to say we will be quite militant about what we require central government to do, but actually beyond the boundaries of central government, local government, NHS providers, schools and so on, we actually want them to take responsibility for what they do themselves. But we are consulting actually about a different approach to procurement across the piece. And, you know, this is just basic good practice. The contracting authorities, wherever they are, will benefit from doing this in a different way. This is not asking different contracting authorities to do something which is against their interest. It's absolutely in their interest, because they will get better value by opening up competition to the widest array of potential suppliers. And I've just picked up the point Beth made about we're too often trapped in a world where we think we know what the answer is, and we're just going to go through a process to find the cheapest provider of that solution. And what we do too little is to have processes which enable innovative suppliers to provide innovative solutions, completely different solutions. So, you know, we are procurers, people who do, I tend to call them these days procurocrats, who are really who are running a process rather than seeking an outcome. We need to be purchasing the what, not the how. What's the outcome we want? What's the thing we're buying? And we've done a few things to open up innovation to problems we don't even know there might be solutions to. We did something called the Innovation Launchpad, where we invited small businesses, innovative businesses, just to come forward with ideas for doing things differently. And then we ran sort of competition to which were the best ones. And then so you can then run a procurement to try and mobilize it. So we need to find lots more ways of doing this. So opening our minds up, our vision up to new things which we didn't even know were possible. And far too much of the kind of surrounding atmospherics and the legal advice around procurement is, oh, you can't talk to suppliers because somehow that'll prejudice you. Well, actually, we want people who are buying from the private sector, buying things for government using taxpayers' money, to know what the possibilities are. And you're not going to get that unless you're able to engage very directly and informally and knowledgeably and confidently with the market. And so I think we need a very different approach. Move away from the rigid one that says we're going to draw up to the nth degree a specification for both the what and the how, and then just choose the cheapest, to a situation where the people who are doing the procuring are exercising judgment, but then being required to justify that judgment and validate it. And it's a different mindset, and it's quite an uncomfortable one to begin with, but the prize is massive.
Thank you. I love procurocrats. Jamie, that adds another term for the acronym B that you're going to set up. But other thoughts from you, Jamie?
Yes, a little prize there. Well, just maybe, I mean, you're talking about the size of the prize, and those efficiency gains are extremely important. I guess maybe there's a different size of prize when you look at, say, something like, I just wonder if is there anyone here from Mozambique?
Mozambique.
Just wondering, because, in the last, half a week, there's been an outbreak of renewed tension over allegations that the opposition party's area of that country is not gaining sufficiently from the resource finds in that country. So, we're having an important conversation about efficiency gains, and that's extremely important. I don't want to belittle that at all. It's a huge amount of money when it all added up. But in that country, lack of transparency in contracts and payments may result in an outbreak of renewed civil war. Hopefully it will not. And hopefully that's saber rattling and it's sort of negotiation. But it could. And then if that happens, we have resource finds in not dissimilar countries in other parts of the region where the same tendency might play out. So the stakes there, the size of the prize there are significant. And making sure, I just wanted to say that to remind us of, the different prizes at stake here.
Absolutely.
And I think that's just a point worth making. And that's given in a country like Mozambique that's been a relative success story by many standards. I just also want to remind us that most people aren't sort of sitting around waiting for the data from open contracts, to come along with their breakfast cereal. It's that investment in those transmission mechanisms, those institutions, journalists, but also lawyers, accountants, the professional classes, and members of civil society. It is when those bits that make a market and information flow are functioning that the information is sort of well served up for use and fought over properly. That it's when those transmission mechanisms are in place that this information is best used. Those transmission mechanisms, those institutions, that capacity is not often in place in the countries where open contracts may play out with the most at stake. And so how, for example, British aid, because this country is also led in being the first G8 country to get to 0.7, and we hope it remains there despite recent excellent economic growth, because of course it's plagued to GNI, how some of that money might be used to help the strengthening of institutions and capacity to make sure that the data is well used and served up for citizens is extremely important. That capacity building is an extremely important part of this, without which all of that open data is actually can lead to opacity and that point about zombie data.
Very good points, Jamie. If I can just add to that, when we've been doing in the World Bank open budgeting, open contracting, one of our emphases is how to build the capacity of journalists, parliamentarians. We run boot camps so they can actually understand a lot of this. Even if you have the data, you need to understand the terms of the contracts, which can often be very, very technical. And also, if you're dealing with extractives, how do you build the capacity of local communities in their local languages to understand in simple terms what they were supposed to do?
And one of the arguments against open contracts is that people won't understand it.
That's right. That's right.
So,
but they do understand it, but you can actually build their capacity, as you're saying, to understand some of the things that seemingly The other thought I had listening to you on Mozambique is, and it links to the point, the first question that was asked, is we've started working on it, but we'd really welcome working on it with others, geocoding contracts. We've been geocoding aid, we've been geocoding expenditures, government expenditures, but if you geocode contracts, that may show you the spatial disparity and distribution of contracts in ethnically charged or situations like that. So I think it's something we've started to do in the case of extractives in Ghana, actually, and in some other countries. But I think if we geocode contracts, that would actually introduce a degree of equity in distribution of contracts and so on. With this, let me open up to the next round of questions. Michael.
Thanks, Michael Jarvis. And it's a bit unfair to ask a question because I've been intimately involved on this. But first, I wanted to thank the panel because we've actually managed to hold a very healthy tension here about talking about the contract details and data and the process. It's open contracting, and that's come out very clearly. And it's not just the documents. So I wanted to thank you for that. And I think we maybe not got as much of a sense of the global distribution of this work, but things are happening from Mongolia to Peru to Liberia. There's a lot bubbling up around this agenda, and the capacity need is across the board, even in the UK and the US on these details. But one partner I think could help in that capacity building is the private sector. And my question to the group is, when we talk to individual companies, they get this. They know the same arguments that Francis and others have made, that, you know, this will mean for honest companies it's a better level playing field. They should be judged on their merits. They're going to, you know, be able to compete effectively. It's good for anti-corruption measures. They can see the arguments. But I think there's something about the open label that scares them off talking in forums like this. It works really well for OGP, where it's government and civil society. I think if this was labeled as an anti-corruption conference, we probably would have a private sector person on the panel. So I wonder if anyone has thoughts about how we deal with that sort of labeling issue and how we get them more actively engaged in this agenda. Thanks.
Good points. Yes, ma'am. And then right there. Go ahead, first, the lady here.
Thank you very much, Carol Excel. I work with the Access Initiative, part of the World Resources Institute. There are a lot of RTI activists all over the world who are actually in fights with governments to try and get access to contracts. And I'm wondering how we can learn from some of those fights to push this agenda forward. And then the second part to that question, I'd like to also hear a little bit about how you're thinking about issues of certain companies breaching permits and still getting contracts over and over again. I mean, is that part of this agenda? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Like Michael, so Chris Taggart, Open Corporates, the largest open database of companies in the world. Like Michael, we've been involved a bit in open contracting as well. But what I wanted to touch on today was the beneficial ownership announcement this morning, and I wondered, particularly for Francis, whether he saw a direct connection in terms of opening up ownership about companies. You know, who's getting the contracts, and open contracting, and whether he thinks that that's actually going to be, you know, if you like, turbocharge the effectiveness of things like open contracting.
Interesting. Felipe? Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for a very engaging conversation on Twitter. Please keep sending us your questions. We have many, many questions, and so I'm trying to make sure that they're not replicative to the ones that are being asked. Eurocov asks, sometimes procurement goes through government-owned corporations to avoid scrutiny. How can open contracting be applied to those contracts? And then we have a question from Marcela Rosso from Washington, and she asks to Minister Maude and Minister Olivas, how can government ensure that there are mechanisms in place to respond to feedback from citizens on contracting information that is made open?
Okay. There's a lady at the back. You don't mind we take one or two more questions? Okay.
Thank you, Anna Mazur. I'm an independent researcher. One of the main purposes of open contracting and revealing the financial flows is surely to be able to hold the contract to account. But many contracts have fixed terms of 10, 15 years and penalties for actually withdrawing from them. So I'm interested to know the panel's thoughts on what can be done to actually build better contract terms in so that the actual holding to account of those contracts is effective. Thanks. Okay,
there's quite a rich set of questions. If I could, I want to add a question which is on my mind, which is that, underlying opacity of contracts in developing countries is tough politics. You know, people in power, both in government, private sector, stand to benefit from opaque contracts. So the question is one of political economy. How do we break the hold of entrenched networks of corruption? And open contracting as an outcome is clearly something we want to see. But what kinds of pressures, what kinds of coalitions of integrity can be built? How do we generate pressure in the system so you actually build coalitions for reform, so you actually generate pressure from citizens? How do you change and break entrenched networks. Any examples, any guidance you have? So with that, maybe Jamie, I begin on the other side this time with you.
Okay, I mean, that's, I think, the key question. Many countries and different districts will have different answers. I was in a part of Ghana recently where, with SEND, a local grassroots NGO, and we went to a rural area outside Accra, and they were, they call themselves factivists. They have young people, you know, smart kids with smartphones who are going around and documenting, you know, is the nurse turning up? Is the clinic delivering the medications? Was the small bridge between two sub-districts built that was over the ditch on time? And they were documenting this evidence. And on the whole, I'm afraid what they were finding wasn't good. And they were also checking whether their local budget was being actually delivered on time to deliver these services. But their existence gave me hope. And I think, you know, it's organizations like that are helping citizens at a grassroots level get organized and find their voice and making their voices count that will help, you know, articulate this better at a local level and then all the way up from there. I sort of feel like the question you just asked might be also directed to someone like Zito Kabwe, who I just spotted in the corner over there. He's a great Tanzanian parliamentarian. I'd love to hear his answer to that question and what's happening in Tanzania. One thing that we've spotted with interest and want to support more and help scale up is your work on service delivery indicators at the World Bank. You know, tools that help people know how well services are being delivered. So, you know, we've got the open contracts. People you think might know how well services are being delivered in their local area, but they won't necessarily know how they're being delivered in other local areas. And those service delivery indicators are, I think, an important tool that need to be scaled up to help do that. And then ultimately what we've got is, you know, subnational, national informed citizens getting organized, linking to global networks of informed citizens. And, you know, this might sound, highfalutin and optimistic talk, but I think we need a movement of global informed citizens around the world, call them factivists or whatever you want, who are, you know, helping reformers within government and hassling obfuscators in government and the private sector to improve results and services so that resources get transmitted into results for citizens in every subnational, national, and regionally and globally. And if we get all of that together, we have a much better shot at getting to zero extreme poverty by 2030. But be in no doubt, we're not going to get there if contracts are not open and that central part of the wheel is not opened up so that the sectors aren't busted open. And that's an extremely important point, which I'm not sure if this is the last comment, so that's why I'm partly summing up.
No,
you know, so I think that's sort of you know, a central point, and that's how we can both, from the bottom up, build a movement, and then as we're improving these global governance norms, like things like the public register for the beneficial ownership of companies, the open contracting, we're also providing the context in which all those bottom-up efforts can link and use networks of open and improved data sources. And that's how, you know, this movement's going to sing and sort of turn all these dry, dusty data sheets into better services for citizens. You know, that's what I think we're all working towards.
Very good, Jamie. Jane?
So I love the idea of the global network of factivists. That's absolutely fantastic. Just to pick up on one point there, though, the only way that will actually get turned into good services is exactly this point about what happens when that feedback gets to the public services themselves and what actually happens as a result of that. And I think it's one of the most difficult areas, actually, for public leaders themselves and for those who are actually running public services, because they get this feedback and sometimes they find it very, very difficult to deal with, to actually to actually deal with what is often, you know, criticism. And even if it's not criticism, it is league tables. It's kind of, you know, that kind of open scrutiny can actually be very difficult to deal with, and I think it has been a real issue in some of our public services actually dealing with that. And I think where we've seen the best examples of that, there's a very good service here, set up by a GP here in this country called Patient Opinion, the Patient Opinion website, where people talk about their experience of using the health service, and that met with some resistance initially from the people actually in the hospitals and the health service themselves. But I think actually as people have opened up to that and realised that this is in order to improve all of the public services, I think that we need to find ways to kind of be able to actually use that feedback positively.
Thanks, Jane. Julian?
Me gustaría referirme a cómo sirve todo este sistema de contrataciones abiertas para combatir a la corrupción. Adicionalmente al portal de Compranet que señalaba yo está establecido en México, tenemos 3 figuras: los contratos marco, donde previamente la Secretaría de la Función Pública acuerda con un sector que proporciona un bien, un servicio, las condiciones de los contratos y el precio máximo. Y esto permite a las dependencias y entidades irse sumando a estos contratos marco y también a los proveedores. Entonces así garantizamos un precio máximo y no tener distintos precios por un mismo bien, por un mismo servicio. También las ofertas subsecuentes de descuentos. Tenemos actualmente en México una oferta subsecuente de descuento muy importante en medicinas y material de curación que está encabezando el Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social. Esto nos permite obtener precios muy bajos en todas las medicinas que compra el gobierno federal. Vamos a comprar alrededor de 42,000 millones de pesos este año. Y lo encabeza el IMSS y se suma el ISSSTE, que es la otra institución que tenemos en México, la Secretaría de Salud, gobiernos de los estados y, por ejemplo, Petróleos Mexicanos, que tiene servicios médicos directos a sus trabajadores. Y el director de Petróleos se sumó por primera ocasión porque dijo: a mí mi trabajo es extraer el petróleo y refinarlo, no andar comprando medicamentos, que lo haga el especialista, que es el Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social. Entonces logramos una concentración muy importante. Y otro tipo de contrato y de licitación que tenemos son las compras consolidadas, donde son bienes o servicios que requiere permanentemente la administración pública, y entonces se juntan varias dependencias, varias entidades para adquirir ese bien, ese servicio, y se obtienen precios muy importantes con grandes rebajas, y eso evita la corrupción. Un ejemplo de las compras consolidadas son los vales de despensa que se da a los trabajadores del Estado a fin de año. Entonces se juntan varias dependencias, se unen y obtenemos descuentos muy importantes en la compra de esos vales de despensa. También cuando llegué a la Secretaría de la Función Pública, hice la reflexión, bueno, y el Compranet pues sí sirve a los proveedores, sirve a los contratistas, sirve a la ciudadanía, pero a nosotros, ¿en qué nos sirve? ¿Qué es de utilidad? Y lo primero que encargué, vamos a ver son los bienes que más se compra por parte del gobierno. Y para sorpresa de nosotros, nos encontramos un producto que en esta época pensábamos que ya estaba en desuso, que ya no se adquiría en México, que es un borrador líquido de documentos. Ahora que tenemos la aplicación de tecnologías de la información, pues ya quedó muy atrás la utilización de la máquina y el papel normal. Entonces parecía que ya ese producto no se compraba, salvo algunas regiones un poco alejadas de México, donde no llegamos a tener, pero que son mínimas por fortuna en nuestro país. Derivado de eso, aplicamos una auditoría a estas dependencias y estas entidades que compraban volúmenes importantes. Está en proceso la auditoría, estamos por concluirla y vamos a hacer seguramente recomendaciones para no comprar este bien, porque no es útil para las dependencias y luego tiene otro problema, se seca con el paso del tiempo y lo vuelven a comprar al año siguiente. Y entonces se tiene un stock, un inventario muy alto que no es necesario para las dependencias. Entonces también el Compranet está siendo de utilidad para nosotros para corregir deficiencias y para corregir seguramente corrupción qué hay atrás de estas deficiencias. Gracias.
Thank you. Beth?
You have a wonderful person who works for you, Sanjay. His name is Tiago Peixoto,
Yes,
and he wrote a blog post about the semantic extravaganza of open government, in which he talked about the many different terms we use to describe the things that we do. As Jamie said, you could almost insert one word, you could just mix up the different session names and have the same session. But the point is, and this is back to the question about engaging the business community, is what we call open contracting. Many in the private sector call smart contracting. It's the process of using data standards in the drafting of contracts, using open data to make contracts computable, using consistent set of terms and identifiers, a common ontology for contractual terms, again, to make the essence of contracts more intelligible to us and easier to parse. So I think this smart contracting movement is one that it's, as I've had the opportunity to talk to folks there, they don't talk to many folks who are in our world of the open government, the transparency, and other movements. They're thinking, again, as big data businesses, how to do several things. One is, as companies, they also want to get the best deal with the vendors that they procure from. And so they want, just as government does, to save money and develop better solutions. They also, as data-driven businesses, want to do the kind of analysis that we in government are interested in doing because it's that sort of intelligence services is the things that they sell, and they want to sell it also to government in many cases. So I think trying to connect with this world of smart contracting and people who are heavily invested in the question of making contracts more readable and more useful for selfish motives would be perhaps useful bedfellows to keep if we want to try to advance the cause that we all care deeply about. It allows us, and this gets back to Chris's question, when we start to make these contracts computable and we're able to mash it up with the kind of data that the G8 is committing to make available and that Chris is making accessible to everybody through open corporates, that we can then start to build the tools, the dashboards, the apps that allow us to see when is the same company getting the permit over and over and over and over again, despite having countless violations. And when that company, as I mentioned earlier, may appear with 10 different names, but thanks to these new efforts, we now can link them together and realize that the 10 companies are actually one company that has a history of violations and abuse. So I think it's important, again, that we try to pool our efforts and resources because we can't move quickly enough on these issues to not only put the tools in the hands of consumers and civil society, but to put the tools in the hands of government as well to make its regulatory enforcement more effective, as well as its procurement and contracting more efficient. These two things go hand in glove.
Thanks, Beth. I don't know if you realize, with your passion for the subject, your voice has come back. Francis.
Well, I think Beth dealt brilliantly with the question Chris Tarrant raised about the connection between opening up beneficial ownership and open contracting. I mean, it just enables a whole lot of connections to be made and a much bigger holistic picture to emerge. And I just want to pick up a couple of related points. One of which is this thing of, how are you able to take into account previous failures when deciding on the award of contracts? And I remember being given advice that under EU public procurement rules, you are not allowed to do that. So you're not allowed to take any account of previous performance by the same company. I mean, that's insane. And it turns out that it's not true either, which is helpful. And any sane contracting authority would do that. It's not to say failure in one place means they're debarred from all time, but you've got to be able to take account, a proper account of the risks involved and where you award contracts. And there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that opening up this whole territory and then allowing others much cleverer than we are, but many of them sitting in this room, to provide ways to kind of mine that data, because it is a hugely rich source, and provide much greater visibility, much greater genuine intelligence about what's going on, will enable us to do this much better. And it just actually kind of reminded me of the point David Cameron made this morning. I mean, we talked about data as a raw material, and I sometimes make the point that, you know, the first industrial revolution was based on the raw materials of iron and coal and steel. This revolution is based on the raw material of data, and it's not quite a natural resource, but it is a massive resource, and the amount of added value that will come from exploiting it in ways that many of us don't even know might be possible. It's huge, and it all comes back, and why it's such an important subject, comes back to the thing which all of this that we're gathering here for these 2 days is about, which is using transparency to make governments serve their citizens better.
Very good, Francis. Jamie mentioned there was someone from Tanzania. I'm just wondering.
Unfortunately, he just walked out.
Oh, he just walked.
I think
he saw you coming.
Okay, all right. So we just have.
If you don't know Zito,
we just have 10 minutes left. So I want to see if anyone has a burning question. If not, I'll ask for. Yes, go ahead. And just take if there's any 1 or 2 burning questions, and then I'll ask for closing comments from the panel.
Hi, my name's Ian McGill from Spend Network. Is there a risk that we see the contract as the primary vehicle for displaying spend, when actually it's the transactions under the contract, and we need to see the transactions that go with the contracts to make sure that the contracts aren't just a front?
Okay. Why don't we just then turn to closing comments? Let me just mix this up. Jane, do you want to just close with any last thoughts from your side?
So I'll say only that it's been really interesting. Thank you very much for being here, for allowing me to be part of this debate. And the thing I would take away is something maybe Felipe tweeted to me yesterday, which was that this is too technical and people aren't interested in it. That couldn't be further from the truth. People are really interested in it, and we need to make sure that that interest is absolutely built, because these are all about public services and it really matters.
Very good. Minister Livias? Minister Livias? Any final thoughts from you?
Sí, solamente recalcar lo que señalábamos de que tenemos todavía la oportunidad de mejorar el portal que se tiene en México, el Compranet, con este nuevo programa de acción que vamos a tener los próximos 2 años, donde vamos a incluir de manera muy importante una serie de datos, como es el contar con una trazabilidad completa en cada procedimiento de contratación. Y adicionar una figura que en México va de la mano con las contrataciones públicas, que es el testigo social. El testigo social es un especialista técnico que llega a acompañar a las dependencias y entidades, que es designado por el gobierno y apoya desde las bases y todos los procedimientos de contratación. En México tenemos un programa piloto en este año para comprar para 3 estados de la República computadoras para los niños de primaria, de 5º y 6º año de primaria. Y ahí, en ese procedimiento de compra de las computadoras, se designó como testigo social a Transparencia Mexicana, al capítulo de Transparencia Internacional en México, y nos ha acompañado de manera muy importante para darle la total transparencia a este procedimiento de licitación, y de que los bienes que vamos a comprar y que vamos a entregar a finales de año cumpla con todas las condiciones. Se vuelve un tema muy importante el contar con estos testigos sociales en las compras cuantiosas que llega a llevar a cabo el gobierno federal mexicano. Por mí sería todo. Muchas gracias.
Jamie?
Thank you very much for organising the panel. And it's been, I think we've said a lot of that needs to. And there's a danger of aggressive agreement. So I want to go with that consensus. Maybe only to say that we're in danger of being the crowd that all agrees and being better at communicating more widely. I don't disagree that a lot of people care and want this information and care about better services, and there's a lot of people who are interested. I do think that also it is easy to get people interested in the slightly wrong facts, and how the information gets organized and used by campaigners responsibly matters a lot. And so going back maybe to that point about transmission mechanisms and an organized national and global campaigns to use information better responsibly. And that's not something that can just be relied on to happen. It takes some organization. And if more of the people who are gathered in rooms like these could think about how we're feeding that ecosystem of campaigners, those factivists I was talking about, we would not only just get the better technical details, we'll also build that movement of people who are going to help make the reforms sustainable and build on them.
Very good. Thanks. Beth?
So again, thank you very much, and thank you especially for indulging my disabled condition. Thank you also for your tolerance in the audience to listen to my terrible voice. So I will be brief just to say I think this is incredibly important, and I look forward very much to the conversation 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, as we look back and celebrate what we've achieved on open contracting, the way that we look back now almost nostalgically on the beginnings of open data. I will end with one plug, if I might, that one of the ways I think that we do that is by getting really practical about the strategies that we can each undertake in our own communities, whether it's around defining the problem, identifying the solution, writing the bid, competing the bid, evaluating what happens. The Gov Lab today has launched the Gov Lab Academy, which is a training website to share lessons about the specific implementations of strategies around governance innovations. We start today with a module on open data and another on crowdsourcing, but I hope within the next few weeks that we will have one on open contracting with the voices from people in this room about how they're doing it in their own community such that others might learn and be inspired.
Very nice, Beth. Francis?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First of all, thank you, all of you, for taking part. And to just pick up Jamie's point, there's a danger that in this area we just end up all agreeing with each other and telling each other how marvellous we are. The truth is that in this area, we are only at the very, very beginning of this. And I think someone raised the question of how do we build the who's going to be doing the demanding, who's going to be doing the ask, who's going to be putting the pressure on for this to go further and faster. And it will be in different organizations, in different groups, in different places. But I mean, one is the small business arena, the small business community, who get frozen out of a lot of government contracting. It's too difficult, it's too expensive, it's just too difficult. And they should be being very demanding. And, you know, as a legislator, as a member of Parliament, you have a lot of exposure. I mean, legislators have a lot of exposure to small businesses because they're local, they vote, they play a big part in your life as a local representative, and they should use that visibility and that audibility to make the case. And I just wanted to add a final thought on, I think your first question to Jane was about the role of the media in all of this, and this is a broad point on transparency and open government. One of the things that puts off people in government from going down the path of transparency is the thought that all you're doing is giving ammunition to your opponents. I mean, my running gag is that all oppositions favour transparency, And then when they get into government, they favour transparency for the first 12 months while all they're doing is exposing what their predecessors have done. After 12 months, it gets a lot less comfortable because you're exposing what you yourself have done. And it's difficult. We, earlier this year, decided to publish the first report of our major projects authority, the agency in the centre of government that has oversight and gives assurance to the government's major projects, 200 or so of them. And for most of them, we published the rankings, the red, amber, green ratings. This was very uncomfortable, and we knew that what we were doing was giving to a media for whom it's a great story to say, look, the government's really screwing this one up. I mean, even they've given it a red rating. And I think we just have to take a deep breath and go through that. And actually, the truth is, once you start being routinely transparent, a lot of the data that you're putting out is really boring. And it becomes routine. And the value comes from the exploitation, the mining, the analytics, which others will do. And I remember visiting one of the countries in the Maghreb, which is going down the path of much greater transparency, and hearing the frustration of ministers in the government who said, you know, we're doing all this stuff, we're doing transparency, and yet actually everyone thinks there's more corruption than there was. And that's, of course, because it's being exposed. You don't know that there's corruption happening, you kind of suspect it, while it's being covered up. It's when you start to expose it. And there is this real kind of difficulty. We have to give support. We have to give such support to reformers as they take this really difficult step. And you get over the hump of, you know, the difficulty of exposing bad things that have been happening, and really explain it isn't because there are more bad things happening, it's actually that we're exposing it more, and as a result there'll be less bad things happening in future. And I think the role of the media in this is very important, to put a kind of balanced story out. You know, just finishing on the Major Projects Authority report that we did have an uncomfortable few days with media coverage, but we got through it. One of the things that I think was mentioned downstairs in the plenary earlier was, you know, there has been around the world really a crisis of trust in governments and politicians. One of the ways you start to rebuild that trust is by telling the truth about the things that are going badly. And if people hear you saying things that seem to be against your interest, being voluntarily talking about things that aren't going well, then it's just possible that when you say things that are going well, it's just possible people might believe you. But it's a really important first step towards rebuilding trust.
Thank you very much, Francis. This was quite a fabulous panel. I wasn't going to do this, but I wanted to just, I wasn't planning to say this, but I wanted to close by sharing a little personal story with you as I was reflecting on this conversation, just to bring it to life. So I come from the poorest state in India, which is the state of Bihar. And my father used to be a government official who rose on merit and finally found himself, his job was to award public contracts for public works. And he was very honest, and he refused to budge on pressure. And I remember growing up that every conceivable pressure and threats were brought upon him, and he would not budge. In the end, the politicians got him out. His was a lonely struggle. He left the country, came back, retired, and became a social activist, a civil society activist. And the last act of his life, that literally the day he died in an accident, was writing a 70-page public interest litigation against corruption in a road project on a contracting abuse. And he died in an accident that day. These are lonely warriors in developing countries. And this is the reality of open contracting and corruption in open contracting. And as I'm reflecting on this event today, it's a twist of destiny, it's a twist of irony, that here we are in the powerful corridors, and we have a conversation going on and a movement. We need a movement on open contracting so that these lonely warriors can join hands and become much more powerful together. Our campaign here is not of the World Bank, it's not of DFID, it's not of UK, it's not of Mexico. It's a collective campaign that we need to join hands in. And so the Open Government Partnership represents that kind of collective movement and campaign that we need to empower these lonely warriors who want to make the world a better place and who want to ensure that public resources are used for the benefit of the poor. And so with that, I just want to invite you to join us in this partnership and want to end by telling you that the most popular tweet that has come up is that it's the time for factivists to fight procurocrats. Thank you very much. Please thank our panel.